Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythologies, and we have a very special episode for you today. This is the Season 2 finale, and we're finally tackling a subject that has been requested over and over again. We're finally discussing the infamous Bermuda Triangle. But before we get into that, I quickly want to give a huge shout out to New Belgium Brewery and Rheingeist Brewery out of Cincinnati, as well as Outer Belt Brewing and the infamous Brewdog. Those have been the fuels for this season. Also, a quick shout out to the subscribers, the followers, the ones that have donated, the ones that have supported, the ones that have actually sent me beer. In the description of every episode, there's a link. There are 3 tiers you can subscribe to. It's 99 cents a month. It really helps the show out. I want to thank everybody that has done that so far. Also, the show now has an Instagram page. I created an Instagram page, and that thing has about 500 followers right now. So let's see if we can continue to keep that growing and getting it bigger and bigger and bigger. So without further ado, the much requested Bermuda Triangle. And where's a good place to start? Right at the beginning. So to be perfectly blunt, the Bermuda Triangle mythology, urban legend, whatever you want to call it, it's actually a very modern myth. We don't really even see that name appear until 1964, and it appears in a pulp novel by a person named Vincent Gratis, who wrote an article called The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, and he was talking about Flight 19 and all the crazy disappearances that were going on in that area at the time and throughout history. So up until then, this area didn't really have a name, if you want to call it that, and it was just an area in the North Atlantic where all this crazy weird stuff happens. And the first instance of this crazy weird stuff actually happens in 1492. So Columbus, he's sailing around the Caribbean, performing his atrocities and convincing himself that he's somewhere in East Asia because the guy was an idiot at math and couldn't properly calculate the circumference of the earth. But he notes in his journal at one point that his compass went berserk once they touched an unseen boundary between Florida and Puerto Rico, which would become a common theme in a lot of future disappearances. They always all complain about their compasses or their instruments going berserk or just failing to work. It's also noted in a journal that while he was on the Santa Maria, they looked up into the sky and they saw fire, or a fiery object, or a fireball, or that's how they explain it, as a fiery object in the sky, which could be a precursor that alludes to a lot of the UFO sightings and activity that supposedly happens in this triangle. Now, to be honest, we don't see a lot of native accounts or native histories of any strange phenomena going on in this triangle before, we Europeans arrive. However, that could just be because we erased that history when we committed genocide against those people. However, in the voodoo or hoodoo religions, they actually do call it the Hoodoo Sea, and it's this mysterious area where ships vanish and people vanish, and there's these strange events and strange weather patterns and whatnot and so forth. So that could possibly allude to some kind of mysticism which surrounds this place throughout history. So for context, let's describe where we're at in the world right now. So the area of the triangle, it varies from person to person, but it's generally thought that its vertices are Miami, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda, which actually makes it an isosceles triangle. So, hey, something from high school or college math is actually relevant for once in my life. So a conservative estimate of the size is about 1.3 million kilometers squared. And in that 1.3 million kilometers, it's open ocean and some Caribbean islands. And while, yes, it is an extremely busy shipping lane from everything from pleasure craft to cruise ships to big cargo ships and military stuff going on throughout history, it is a heavily populated area. However, that doesn't discount the mysterious, weird stuff that goes on in this area that nobody can explain. And it's not always cases where a ship sinks or an airplane runs out of fuel and crashes into the ocean. A lot of these instances are where crews have disappeared, or where the ships or the planes or whatever have simply disappeared and have never been found or heard from again. Because a lot of times, if a ship were to simply sink, with modern technology, we wouldn't have too hard of a time finding it. Usually we find some wreckage or something of the sort in the general area. But in a lot of these cases, nothing is ever found. They just disappear into the ether. And when you get a mysterious disappearance like that, a lot of questions arise. What's causing it? Is it just weird weather patterns? Is it some paranormal force? Is it some supernatural force that we don't understand? Is it alien abduction? Hell, is it something to do with parallel universe theory, or even the idea of Atlantis being in this area? Or is it something as mundane as some kind of environmental issue that we currently don't understand with our current technology? And people who have written about the triangle have looked into these supernatural theories, these theories that I'll talk about now. Or I guess we actually have to call them hypotheses, but I digress. So one of these hypotheses is actually an explanation that pins the blame on some leftover technology from the mythical lost continent of Atlantis, which I'm not going to discuss the Atlantis myth here. That is a subject for another episode. It's actually a planned episode for the future, so watch out for that one. But it was actually a man who was a psychic here in the United States named Edgar Cayce back in like the 1930s, I believe. He predicted that evidence of Atlantis would be discovered in 1968, and it kind of falls within this interesting discovery that was made in 1968, the infamous Bimini Road. Now, for context, Cayce was a well-respected clairvoyant, and a lot of his predictions actually did become true to a certain degree. The Bimini Road, we know it's not Atlantis. It's a naturally occurring form of beach rock that has broken up in this interesting pattern off of the coast of Bimini Island in the Bahamas. However, when they first discovered it, it looked like a road or a wall that had been submerged. And the idea of cities and stuff that are submerged under the water isn't new. I mean, that goes back to, there are Egyptian cities that are now underwater because sea levels rise. And hell, even in Jamaica, outside the triangle, but still in the same sea, in 1692, Port Royal was rocked with a massive earthquake which sank a big portion of that city. So the idea of sunken cities has been around, and if you have something that looks like a perfectly cut, neat, laid out road, you could allude that to that Atlantis myth, which, like I said, I'll get into the Atlantis myth in a future episode. But a lot of people who have searched for Atlantis, they believe that it was in the area around or near the Caribbean, around or near the infamous Bermuda Triangle when it sank. And maybe some kind of high technology or high magic or something that we don't know about is causing these disappearances. Now, other people think that a parallel universe exists within the Bermuda Triangle, or that within the Bermuda Triangle there's this kind of soft spot in our universe where you can travel into another parallel universe. And this might actually give some explanation as to why people who have maybe traveled to this parallel universe but survived and came back or whatever, that's why they might talk about weird time fluctuations, or the fact that their instruments aren't working or their compasses aren't working. Compasses not working properly is a big indicator. Maybe they get a glimmer of this parallel universe. Maybe they actually travel into it and the rules of physics just don't work there the way it works here in our universe. Or maybe their north is our west, or maybe the layout of like where Florida is different. Or maybe some of these lost crews, these lost ships, these lost planes, maybe they pass that barrier into that next universe and they have no way to get back, so they end up living the remainder of their lives there. We just don't know. And to me, a multiverse theory is not out of the realm of possibility. A lot of physicists today allude to a multiverse theory, that we exist across an infinite plane of universes. However, I do dissent to one idea when it comes to that hypothesis. A lot of these scientists, when they propose the multiverse theory, they propose a theory of the universe being like these enclosed bubbles, and they're just like kind of bouncing off each other, and when two of them come together, they can form another universe or whatever. I don't really see it like that. I always thought of it more as like, think of a deck of unshuffled playing cards. You get playing cards, and the first time you open the deck, they're all in order. I think it's like that. I think every universe is kind of sandwiched together like that, and the universes that you're sandwiched next to are going to be very similar, and then the further you go out, the wilder and crazier it gets. That's just my personal hypothesis about multiverse theory, but I digress. Let's get back to the triangle. So another paranormal theory or hypothesis that goes on about the triangle is that it's a high hub for UFO activity. So maybe these are alien abductions. Now, personally, I don't really see it that way, because if aliens were to visit our planet, why would they just hang around the area where there's just shipping lanes? That seems kind of boring. I would probably, if I wanted to explore, Earth as an alien, I'd probably be hanging out in like New York or London or something. I don't know if I'd be hanging out in the Caribbean unless they just really like the climate and that Caribbean kind of attitude, I guess. Of course, if their job was to just go around abducting people who are flying over basically the ocean or sailing across the ocean, might just be a good tactic, because then the humans would be like, well, they were just lost at sea. But there always does seem to be some idea of aliens, UFOs associated with the Bermuda Triangle since at least the late 40s. But other reasons for the disappearances are a lot more mundane. It could be simple as violent weather. This is the area over the sea where weather can turn on a dime, and out of nowhere a violent storm can come. Or rogue waves, especially if you're on a ship. Rogue waves can come out of nowhere, and they can potentially sink your ship. Even like a huge cruise ship, it could probably sink that. And in this area, hurricanes and gales can pop up seemingly out of nowhere. Before you know it, 1 second you're sitting there, the sky is clear. The next second, you're in the middle of a hurricane. So it's a pretty dangerous place overall, just due to the very nature of the weather. There's also one very strange but entirely plausible idea for why a lot of ships go missing, and it comes from methane hydrates. So for context, simply put, methane is a gas that exists in our Earth, and there's this thing called mud volcanoes. They're basically underwater volcanoes, and it's normally when like natural gas is escaping underwater, and a lot of people can hypothesize that these things go off and this methane is released, and methane being a gas, it naturally wants to travel up. And what it does is, first off, it makes the water really frothy and kind of violent looking. But secondly, it actually decreases the density of the water, and that can sink like a full cargo ship. And the Bermuda Triangle would be a place where something like that does occur. And there's also this weird idea of a time vortex where planes will actually fly into what's essentially like a lightning storm, cloudy weather, or whatever, and it can actually push them forward in time as well as distance. There was actually a case of this where a plane flew into one of these almost like vortexes, and it looked just gray skies. That's all they saw was gray skies, and they just kept going straight. And by the time they exited it, not only were they of vast distance ahead of where they were supposed to be, but they actually saved about 10 gallons of fuel because the time difference was like an hour or so. They saved like an hour on their flight, so they shot both forward in time and in distance. Now, that pilot, I believe he went on to do like several interviews and people wrote books about him and stuff, but him being a natural skeptic, he thought it had something to do with that storm and the way the lightning activity maybe gave him some kind of like boost in efficiency to his plane and actually, I guess, reduced drag, which made him fly faster and I guess more straight. But even he said that like the instruments were all screwed up at the time. But I think he also alluded that to like the electricity in the atmosphere doing that. And speaking of mysterious incidents which take place in the triangle, let's discuss a few of those. Now, I'm going to only touch on the highlights, and there really isn't any data pre-1800, but 1800 is where I'm going to start, and that's with the USS Pickering. So the Pickering was a topsail schooner in the United States Revenue Cutter Service, which was basically like a customs enforcement service that later merged with the Coast Guard, I believe. But this schooner sailed out of Newcastle, Delaware on 20 August 1800 and was never heard from again. It was supposed to go to the Guadalupe station in the West Indies to meet up with Commodore Thomas Thurston's squadron to basically, do its job. And it was presumed to have been lost in a gale in September, but that was never proven. I guess there were no records of a gale in the area at the time. And at the same time, the USS Insurgent also vanishes without a trace. And when I say without a trace, I mean there was nothing. All hands disappeared. The ships disappeared. There was no wreckage ever found. Normally in a storm, if a ship gets beaten up or something, especially like a schooner, you might find wreckage floating on the surface near where the storm was. None of that was ever found. And to this day, it still remains a mystery of what happened to those ships. Did they sail into a parallel universe and spend the rest of their lives there? Did they sail into a time vortex and get shot forward or backward in time? Hell, are they in some weird parallel dimension or something where they're still sailing around the Caribbean to this day, perpetually lost and perpetually looking for port? We don't know. And 14 years later, the USS Wasp, which was, I believe it was a sloop, and it actually saw action in the War of 1812. It fought off like 3 British warships. Post the war, it actually sailed back to the Caribbean, never to be heard from again. A lot of people think that the ship foundered at sea and sunk. However, it sails towards that same area and is lost to this day. It's never found. Its remains have never been found. And it disappeared with 140 on board. Navy men, U.S. Navy men. And let's even jump to the 20th century, the USS Cyclops. It was a Protus-class collier built for the United States Navy. Now, this was an enormous ship, and it was carrying manganese ore, which is used to make munitions, basically. So it was sailing up the Caribbean to, I believe, Maryland with 306 crew on board, and it disappears without a trace on or around March 4th, 1918. Now, a lot of people speculated that the Germans had something to do with it because it was carrying manganese ore, which was used in munitions. This is 1918, and they were losing the war, and they did have U-boats off of our coast. But the ship was in a non-combatant role at the time, and it's highly doubtful that the Germans knew that the thing was even carrying manganese ore. So it's highly doubtful that the Germans did sink that ship while they were sending their U-boats out and sinking American shipping at the time. By this time, the war was already lost in Germany, and they had other things to worry about other than, sinking ships in the Caribbean. So that ship also disappears without a trace, and it becomes the biggest loss of life in a non-combat mission in U.S. naval history. And it remains a mystery to this day of what happened to it because its remains were never found. And then let's jump to 1945, December 5th, 1945, the infamous Flight 19. And I'm not going to go into a full Wikipedia article on Flight 19. If you want to read the whole thing, go online and read it. But here's the gist of it. So on December 5th, 1945, 5 General Motors TBM Avenger torpedo bombers are on a training mission. There's 14 airmen on this flight, and they're on this training mission, and they do their bombing run, and they go to turn back to come back to Florida. Well, their instruments start going haywire and they get lost. They disappear, never to be seen again. And in the subsequent search, Martin PBM Mariner flying boat also disappears along with 13 crewmen. None of these aircraft nor the remains have ever been found to this day. They are thought to have crashed into the ocean. However, they did a massive search of the area and even like the surrounding areas based on like their fuel capacity, and there's never been a trace of them ever found. Now, a lot of people blame this on their inexperience. These guys, they didn't have like as much flight time as you think a pilot would have. And actually the leader of this like training squad or whatever, he had to be rescued twice before over the ocean for getting lost, because I'm guessing this was one of those guys that just never trusted his instruments. But at one point they actually do say that they spot land, and it's a broken pieces of land, and they thought they were in the Keys, so they thought they had to head east. And when they head east, they just end up heading further out to sea. And the last radio transmission given is basically Taylor. He was the leader of the squad, the guy who had to be rescued twice in the past. He was heard saying on the radio, "All planes close up tight. We have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, or 38 liters, we all go down together." So they're running low on fuel and they're planning to ditch, and this is the last like radio recording from him. It's rumored that the very last radio recording anybody got was one pilot saying, "This looks strange." Now, they did conclude after their investigation, they concluded that Taylor was not at fault because the compasses did stop working, and it's a running theme that instruments go kind of screwy in this area. And to me personally, that alludes to multiverse theory. I think they flew into a parallel universe and crashed. I think when they saw the Keys and said this looks strange and they couldn't find land, maybe they flew into some parallel universe where, Florida is a series of small islands, or maybe it doesn't exist, or the layout's different, or the layout of the Caribbean is different. Or maybe they ended up crossing into one of these time vortexes and ended up in a future where the majority of Florida lies underwater, which is why they couldn't find it. And maybe that radio transmission actually came back through the vortex from a future that they flew into. We do not know. Even in the report, they actually write, they just disappear. It's as if they flew to Mars. Me, personally, I think they crash landed in a parallel universe or in the future through either a time vortex or a soft spot in between the universes. But that's the fun of the mystery. We just don't know. It could be anything. Some people say that the whole squadron was beamed up by an alien craft. We don't know. But those wouldn't be the only planes to go missing in the Triangle. In 1948, on January 30th, the Star Tiger, it was an Avro Tudor passenger aircraft operated by British South American Airways, which disappeared without a trace. It took off from Santa Maria Airport in the Azores. It was going to Bermuda, and it disappeared without a trace. Then on December 28th of 1948, a Douglas DC-3 was lost with 3 crew and 36 passengers en route from San Juan, Puerto Rico to Miami, Florida, never to be seen again. In 1967, we're actually going back to a ship. A Miami hotel owner, he was named Dan Burrick. He was a rich guy, and he takes out his cabin cruiser, which is a yacht, and the irony was it was named Witchcraft. Well, they're only 1 mile off of the Miami coast, and they want to see the Christmas lights. He takes this priest out to go see the Christmas lights, and they're out there. And that night, Burek, he radios a distress call to the Coast Guard and informs them that the boat's propeller had struck something underwater and that the vessel needed to be towed in. And the Coast Guard requested that he send a flare up, and he's like, yeah, I got flares. The thing's not damaged, it's just I can't drive it. It's not going to sink, but I'll shoot a flare off when you get close by. The Coast Guard goes out there, and the witchcraft is gone. Never to be seen again. It just disappears. It's never been found, and to this day, it's still just gone. And that's only 1 mile off the coast of Miami. 1 mile. 1 mile is nothing. Like, you can see further than a mile. 1 mile off the coast of Miami, this ship disappears, never to be seen again. And furthermore, in 1969, on August 4th, the Great Isaac Lighthouse, it's a lighthouse on this little spit of rock on the Bahamian island of Great Isaac Cay. It was erected in 1859, and it's located about 20 miles or 32 kilometers northeast of Bimini Islands. So on August 4th, 1969, the station was discovered to have been completely abandoned by its 2 keepers. Now, while a hurricane did pass by a couple of days prior, this wasn't really determined to be the reason why these men disappeared. Because if a hurricane was on the horizon, they would have just left and come back. But these guys disappear without a trace. They're never found again. And since then, since that disappearance, the lighthouse has remained abandoned since. Now, if you're a tourist, you can go there and you can see the building and the lighthouse and whatever, but it does fall in disuse and it is basically a ruin today. But those 2 men, they just disappear into the ether. There's nothing to be found. And even as recently as February 2017, the Turkish Airlines flight TK-183, that's an Airbus, it was actually forced to change direction from Cuba to Washington Dulles Airport after some mechanical and electrical problems which occurred over the triangle. And there have also been cases of ghost ships appearing in the triangle. Ships where the entire crew has disappeared and they're just adrift, and people come across them and there's no explanation as to what happened to the crew. One ship that comes to mind is the Carroll A. Deering. It was an American 5-masted commercial schooner. It was launched in 1919, and it was found run aground without its crew off Cape Hatteras in North Carolina in January 1921. So on its final voyage, on July 19, 1920, it sailed from Puerto Rico and arrived at Newport News to pick up a cargo of coal for delivery to Rio de Janeiro. And during this voyage, they actually head to Lewes, Delaware, because the captain becomes very sick and they have to replace the captain. So on September 8th, 1920, they arrive in Rio and they deliver their cargo without incident. So the captain, he's a man named Wormel. He gives the crew leave and they're hanging out in Rio. However, there's some discontent sowing amongst the crew. The captain basically talks trash about his crew and says that the only person he really trusts is the engineer on board the ship. He's basically like one of those dick bosses that's always like, well, my employees suck at what they do. One of those bosses, or captains, I guess, that always blames the crew for everything and never takes responsibility for his own mistakes. We've all had bosses like that. But anyway, they leave Rio on December 2nd, 1920 and stop for supplies in Barbados. And this is where the first mate, his name was McKellen, he gets drunk in a local bar and he starts kind of trash talking the captain and complaining that he has to do all the navigation because this captain, who's 66 years old, has poor eyesight and he can't navigate and blah blah blah. And he said, I'll get that, captain, before we get to Norfolk. So on January 9th, they set sail again, and the next time the ship was sighted, it was by the Cape Lookout lightship off of North Carolina on January 28th. So the Deering hails the ship, and the captain of this lightship, he's a man named Captain Jacobson, he reported that a tall, thin man with reddish hair and a foreign accent, speaking through a megaphone, has informed him that the vessel has lost its anchors in a storm off of Cape Fear, and ask that the ship's owners of the GG Deering Company be notified. Now, Jacobson takes note of this, but his radio is out, so he's actually unable to report it. But Jacobson also takes note of something interesting. He notices that on the quarterdeck of the ship, which is usually where like ceremonies take place and like the captain's headquarters and stuff, that members of the crew are just kind of milling around. And that's generally an area they're not really allowed to be in unless there's some kind of like ceremony taking place or something like that. So it's kind of odd. He notes that as a kind of strange thing. Now, the following afternoon, the crew of another vessel in the area spots the Deering sailing a course that would take it directly onto the Diamond Shoals. They, however, saw no one on the ship's deck and didn't attempt to hail the schooner, and they were assuming that the crew would spot Cape Hatteras Lighthouse or the Diamond Shoals lightship and change course to avoid wrecking on the shoals. However, that's precisely what happens. The ship does run hard aground onto the shoals. So the ship basically sits there until February 4th when they can actually send men to go investigate this wreck because it's kind of a treacherous area and they couldn't really get to it. But when they reach this ship, they find no people, nobody. The ship had been abandoned, the wheel had been thrashed, the rudder was disengaged from its stock, the navigation equipment was gone, the crew's personal effects and 2 lifeboats were gone. However, the foodstuffs were still there. They were being prepared for the next day. So it's a mystery of what happened to this crew. A lot of people think that it was a mutiny that took place. They killed the captain, threw him out to sea, and then crashed the ship to cover it up. Nobody really knows, and it's one of these infamous ghost ships that show up in the Triangle. And as always, nobody from the crew is ever found, nor does anybody ever come forward to say, hey, I was on that crew and here's what happened. These people just all disappear into nothingness, never to be heard from again. And another famous ghost ship that was found adrift in the Atlantic south of Bermuda on 26 September 1955 was the Connemara 4. Now, this ship was a pleasure yacht, and it was found completely abandoned, and nobody who was on that yacht was ever heard from again. And it's in the 60s and the post-60s where people start writing books about this stuff, about these losses and the Bermuda Triangle, and it gets into the mindset of the general populace, and it sparks this really awesome mythology, this really awesome urban legend about this strange place in the Caribbean in our own backyard, and people go missing and disappear, and all these weird events happen, and there's ghost ships and planes go down and all this crazy stuff. Now, a lot of people will tell you, hey, I've been on cruise ships 100 times. I've been in the Bermuda Triangle. There's nothing weird going on there. Yeah, the weather can be a little crazy, but you're on the ocean. What do you expect? And there's those people that say, well, it's an extremely heavily trafficked area of the ocean. Of course there's going to be ships going down, and when you get a hurricane or you get some weird weather event and a plane's going to crash, that's normal. That happens all the time. What's so special about that? And to those people, I say, yeah, you're probably right. There's probably nothing special about it. However, sometimes late at night, if you let your mind kind of linger on what happened to those people that disappeared, and how come no evidence of those disappearances or those people or those ships was ever found, you start to kind of poke holes in the actual real logic of it. And when you do that, you start to question your reality a little more and start thinking of these other possibilities. And at the end of the day, that's the fun of it right there. It's that innate not knowing and questioning what you think you know. It's what keeps these myths and legends and mysteries alive. And I feel that that is what makes the world a more interesting place. And I hope we continue to keep the world an interesting place, and I hope that curiosity never goes away because that just fuels this show. And speaking of this show, you have been listening to the season finale of Urban Legends and Mythologies. I thank you for listening. I want to thank all of my supporters, my followers, all the people that have donated. Hell, anybody who's even ever shared a link or shared the podcast. I mean, that's literally how the thing grows, your word of mouth. If you're sitting in the office and you're bored and, tell your buddy, hey, I'm listening to this really cool podcast, you should check it out. It's about urban legends and stuff. People love this stuff, to be honest. If people didn't love these stories, they wouldn't be such a huge part of our culture and various cultures around the world. But you don't have to wait too long for season 3. I'm only going on hiatus for about 3 weeks. And during that interim, I'm just going to be doing some little stuff. I might release more of that drunk karaoke stuff. I don't know why, but people seem to like it. I'm completely vocally tone deaf if you can't tell. But for some reason, people like that, so I might keep doing them. And I might just throw like a 5-minute mythology or some off-topic random thing. Maybe like a one-shot episode that's completely on a totally different topic. I don't know. I'll figure it out. I've got 3 weeks. And I've got a ton of stuff backlogged that basically gets edited out anyway. So maybe I'll combine that into something. I don't know. Maybe like an outtakes thing. But I do appreciate all of you listeners. I thank you for listening. Please support it. Check out the Instagram. Check out the monthly supporters thing. That's really what's going to fuel the growth of this show, and it's going to fuel better sound quality because, yeah, like I said, I like the zero production style. I like the rawness, but I would like to improve it to give you guys a better listening experience, and I hope we can achieve that in season 3. And on that note, I'll see you at the season 3 premiere in August.